All right. Okay. How's that? Can everyone see my screen?
Looks great.
Okay, great. Thanks. So this project is a really interesting project, and I didn't do it alone. I really want to thank Rachel Burke with Conservation International and Natalie Gross with BLM and many others that I will mention at the end for their help and their contribution. We had multiple meetings to really develop this collaborative drought plan to support a lot of different benefits on the landscape. The intent when Bat Conservation International hired me at Eco Impact Solutions was to develop a plan to center broad scale restoration around agave planting and also to create a framework to be replicated at other locations in the Gila watershed and elsewhere. Um, because of my background, this is definitely a data-driven plan. I use a lot of different tools and data that I'll share with you today, something that may be helpful for you as you think about planning in other places. And I want to thank the National Drought Mitigation Center because the process that I used was really based on their foundation. It's different because this is not an active ranch that is involved in agricultural production, but it's similar in that a lot of the same thought process came from the National Drought Mitigation Center planning framework. So with that, I'll go ahead and dive in and get started and tell you about the ranch. So this is a ranch that's on the border between New Mexico and Arizona. It's in Grant County. It is about 3,400 acres of really high desert terrain, a lot of mountains, steep slopes. It's in the Mogollon Transition South Major Land Resource Area, if you're familiar with that area. And the ranch itself was purchased in 1999 to be a retreat center. And so since then, for more than 30 years, it's been conservatively managed. And really, there's been limited grazing, and it's really been in a time and a period of recovery, which makes it a really interesting place to work. It's also near the Apache Box Wilderness Study area. So that is off to the east. That's a BLM Wilderness Study area. Apache Box itself is really interesting and really beautiful. There's very high biodiversity value at this location, at this ranch. It supports wildlife, including some very important nectar bats and pinyon jay and a lot of other wildlife as well. It was fun to listen to the rancher talk about it. And so this past year, Bat Conservation International and BLM planted 600 agave at this ranch to support the nectar bats that are in the area. So then the goal of this drought plan is to reduce both the short and long-term drought impacts through this proactive planning, like Noah says, like having a plan is better than not having a plan, but also to maintain and improve vegetation condition, biodiversity, and ecological function under drought conditions. So I didn't know a lot about bats. I'm assuming not everybody knows a lot about bats, so I'll just take a moment and say that there are three species of migratory nectar feeding bats that reach the northern edge of the Southwest United States in New Mexico and Arizona. And those three species are listed here. One of them is endangered, the Mexican longnose bat. They all follow this really fascinating nectar corridor from central Mexico up into our area, and some have been noted in the Gila watershed. All three of them have, as for example, all three of them have been seen in the Gila watershed. So they follow the blooming agaves and the cacti, and they're really important pollinators. So it's very important then, the agave are very important for Bat Conservation International, which is why they have Agave Restoration Initiative. That's goal is building landscape scale model to deliver agave restoration at the scales needed for bats and people. And there are some agave conservation challenges, some in Mexico and some in the United States. I'm going to focus on the US since that's where this plan is focused. The main or one of the main issues is landscape degradation driven by historic land use. There's also direct loss of flowering agaves due to livestock and non-native invasive species as well. Climate change and drought overlay this and are really important. And so I just wanted to kind of say that this is the foundation for this plan, is that there are these challenges and climate and drought overlay those. So some specific challenges in Southwest New Mexico and Southeast Arizona. Palmer's agave has undergone range contractions due to climate change and drought, and also accelerated by past and present land uses. There's direct consumption of agave stalks when the agave bolts by livestock. You can see that in the image on the right. And there's also degradation of native plant communities. Their seedling recruitment of Palmer's agave really requires thermal and solar protection, so it needs rocks and grasses and prolonged soil moisture for it to survive. And so even if the goal of the restoration is a single keystone species, the approach that BACI is taking really needs to address these underlying drivers and issues. So that's the context that we approach this with. And then there are three parts of developing this drought management plan. I'm going to talk to you about each of these three parts. And again, they harken back to the National Drought Mitigation Center and some of their planning framework, although it's a bit different in this landscape. So you just really need to start by laying the groundwork, and that's developing the team, identifying past drought impacts, and inventorying what you have, what resources are there, what are your opportunities. And so starting with temperature and precipitation is a good place to begin. This is the 30-year normal precipitation and temperature at the ranch specifically. And you can see there are some different seasons of precipitation. There's some, December through March, there's a little bit of precipitation. This leads to a nice peak in growth in production and grass production there in March and April. And then there's a typical monsoon. You can see July, August, September, some in October. There's also a lot of diurnal temperature variation here. So it's kind of this somewhat harsh landscape, but it certainly has an annual average precipitation of around 15 inches per year. So has some rain, which is certainly very helpful. Um, so also there have been observed increases in annual and summer temperature at the ranch for the last 45 years or so, increase in temperature of about half a degree Fahrenheit per decade. There has been less rainfall over time, a decline of about 1.2 inches per decade over that same time period. Most of the observed reduction in rainfall has been between October and March. Climate models project that there's going to be a decline in median seasonal rainfall between December and May. And of course, we know there's likely a projected increase in temperature as well. So this is no stranger to drought. This county, Grant County, New Mexico, you can see that there are periods where there's no drought. If you look at the vertical axis, it's the percent of the county that's in drought. Again, this is a time series from the National Drought Mitigation Center. So there are times when none of the counties in drought, but there are many more times when at least a portion of the county is in some level of drought. You can see here in 2025, there was an exceptional drought that hovered over a lot of the county for most of the year. We also needed to assess the vegetation, what's happening with the vegetation of the landscape. When the ranch was purchased in 1999, there were some large giant ponderosa and Apache box to the north of the landscape. Most of those have fallen. There are some pinyon juniper woodlands, but there's a lot of PJ mortality there. There are some really nice perennial grasses there. UNM did a 2025 vegetation study where they found some very rare plants out there. There are some invasives, but they are not pervasive. There are some, but they're really not taking over, but something to look at. And so we identified those in the plan to help, pay attention to what's out there. And then there are some vulnerable riparian areas. And this is the first data source that I'm going to or tool really that I'm going to talk about. And it's a seed lot selection tool developed by Bryce Richardson out of the Forest Service. And this tool really helps you identify in your particular location, what plants should you plant there for future conditions. And so the dark orange this map is showing where the plants currently are that would do well at this particular ranch in the future. And for us, that looks like a few different types of oak, alligator juniper, agave, and yucca. And there are many more, but that's just a way to see what you should plant in a particular location. And thankfully, agave is on the list because 600 agave were planted at this ranch over the past year. There were 300 were planted in this purple area, and that's private land. Another 300 were planted on BLM lands. You can also see there are 3 active springs on the landscape. The top one is kind of continuously flowing. The bottom 2 are intermittent. And then there are some livestock access as well. So the agave themselves for this project came from the Gila Native Plant Nursery in Safford, Arizona. You can see that image in the bottom left. And they were planted on the landscape. You can kind of see them in the picture in the middle, the cages. The agave are not always planted in cages, but for this particular location, they were protect the agave from javelina and some other issues. They also used rock mulch. You can see the rocks around the base of the agave. They're also a part of a study that's being done by a graduate student at New Mexico State University. So having the cages is important for that study as well. As I mentioned, there's some tree mortality. You can see that in the rangeland analysis platform. Information here showed in 2018 and 2025. You can see that there's some areas where you definitely have pinyon juniper cover, maybe a contraction of that area. And then you can also see that happening on the landscape over here to the right, where there are certainly some dead trees, and this is normal in the entire, region. You can see this across the landscape. But the question is this just drought related or is there an insect involved? And that would be something great to study in the future. Also assessing operations. So what's happening at this ranch? There's limited cattle operations. There are some cows there, but they're just happy cows on the landscape. They do provide a supporting role for neighboring ranches, but the ranch itself really prioritizes habitat and wildlife um, and the ecosystem. There's a perimeter fence that was completed in 2017, which is really helpful because a lot of the neighboring cows were getting into the landscape. But in 2025, this ranch did operate as a grass bank. So they allowed neighboring cattle onto the ranch. They actually didn't charge any money for that, but it was just such dire situation, and so many cows were perishing that they opened up their landscape for that. And so it's important, and I'll get back to the grass banking a little bit later. Also assessing the water resources and the infrastructure. There's pretty strong water resources here. 6 wells across the landscape, and they seem to perform pretty well. 3 of these pictures here are showing Apache Creek. You can see that there has been some cattle access to the creek. There's certainly some filamentous algae, and it would be great to get the algae assessed, what type of algae is there. You can see the creek itself really flows during the monsoon season. And the bottom right shows one of the 5 livestock water sources that are available on the ranch. We showed the 3 springs. There's another creek, Bitter Creek, at the south part of the ranch, but it's rarely flows currently, and part of the reason for that has to do with an upstream local mine that's been dewatering the stream. So there's some issues related to that. Okay, so that's the background information. And now we get into what to do before drought. What can we do right now before drought hits to really improve conditions? So we used a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. We defined objectives for increasing drought preparedness and strategies for building preparedness before drought. So through the SWOT analysis, we came up with some challenges. There's potential for high severity wildfires. There are vulnerable riparian areas. There's the tree mortality I mentioned. There are erosive soils on steep slopes. There's outside cattle access to the ranch, even though the fence was built. They can be wily and get into places, and that certainly happens. There can be limited food and water for wildlife during drought. Mature and planted agave are vulnerable to wildlife and livestock. Cattle have access to the natural springs. There looks like there's potentially poor water quality in Apache Creek. And then, of course, water scarcity impacts to local systems can happen, especially during drought. But the ranch has some strengths. It's been experiencing long-term ecological improvement over the past 30 years. A key strength is there's a low stocking rate and small herd size. The water infrastructure is generally reliable and wells have remained functional through past droughts. And then the ability to operate as a grass bank provides a management tool, right? It can reduce fuels, you can have some targeted grazing, and it also is a mechanism to support positive relations with neighboring operations. And that's really important there. So based on those strengths and weaknesses, we came up with some high priority strategies. There are medium and low priority strategies as well, but I'm going to limit it to the high priority strategies for us today, just in the interest of time. So, developing and implementing a grass bank decision framework, we think, is really important and is a component of this drought plan. And so, I'll present elements of that for you at the end of this talk. Thinning and redistributing the dead trees to reduce the fuels and also increase infiltration. At this location, slowing the runoff and increasing infiltration and reducing the erosion are really critical. Protecting the lower Apache Creek through livestock exclusion. And through this process, actually, the BLM started to work with the state to do that. So it's pretty exciting that they're moving forward on this strategy. Also conducting periodic vegetation monitoring, and that's something that BLM has committed to do over the next, each year annually, but they're also considering a longer term vegetation plot. Developing a catastrophic wildfire plan, and that is something that's also included in this drought plan. But I won't talk too much about it today unless you have some questions. And then protecting the mature and planted agave from wildlife and livestock. And that's part of the plan as well. Other strategies, this is really important. Installing erosion control structures can be really helpful. One rock dams and zuni bowls here in particular, and you can see a picture of a planted agave with an erosion control structure over to the right. Rotating water sources to reduce the soil disturbance. Maintaining and repairing the fences, which is possibly one of the most difficult recommended strategies we have, but also pretty important. Retrofitting the drinkers to be wildlife friendly is really critical and could be helpful. Monitoring those key species, which is something that BCI and BLM are doing. Monitoring the well levels and water use, which happens less frequently now than it used to, but could be important in understanding the groundwater use. Fencing off the springs, and then installing a local air quality sensor. And we recommend the Purple Air Zen sensor in this case because it glows the color of the air quality index. So people at the retreat center could know very quickly about how to protect their health and if they should stay inside or what activities they should participate in. So again, those are all the longer term resilient strategies that we're recommending that were high priority. And now I'm going to move into what to do during drought. And again, this came from multiple meetings with multiple people. We came up with some quick response strategies during drought, the timing for those strategies, and then how to know when to implement it. And so this is when we're really going to dive into some of the data that we use to make decisions. So I'm going to just go through this table here. Just know that a lot went into developing this table, but these are the variables that are used to make some choices. First of all, knowing the drought conditions from the US Drought Monitor, and that changes weekly on Thursdays. So we're recommending paying attention to that. There is a local rain gauge, and so measuring that and calculating, summing it up monthly to make some decisions specifically about grass banking. The rangeland analysis platform is another tool that provides production information. And we're recommending looking at that April through August. And then if the production is 100% of the average, then grass banking could proceed. Using GrassCast, which is a production forecast that has two different time frames in this particular region of the country, and using the positive percent difference from normal based on GrassCast. Also, there's the seasonal outlook from the Climate Prediction Center, which can provide some really important information related to grass banking. We're also recommending the fire risk assessment for using the 7-day fire risk. And if that is in moderate, that really people should pay a lot more attention and have some increased awareness related to fire, especially in June and July. And then, of course, water availability. And this is really manual checks on the wells and the tanks, and that's ongoing, looking for reduced capacity. So we developed then this precipitation calendar with critical dates, and it was developed specifically for the ranch based on other calendars that were shared with us by some colleagues, by actually Tanya, who's here today, shared a calendar. We modified that calendar for the decisions that need to be made at this particular ranch. And only two things need to be changed to allow this calendar to work. The first is the average annual precipitation by month. So this is only changed once a year. On Halloween, basically, the last day of October, you would go in and change this annual precipitation by month. And then monthly, you would just put in your precipitation for that month. And then automatically, your percentage average is calculated to help them identify if grass banking is recommended based on the precipitation. There's some other critical dates here. One is assessing the winter precipitation. How did it go? I used 2025 values here so we can kind of have a retrospective and some real numbers. But you can see that the winter precipitation in 2025 was really bad. It was 22% of average. If you wanted to assess grass banking, then you would look at the precipitation since November, so November to August. That was a little better, right? If the November to August period was better, but you still wouldn't recommend grass banking because it's not 75% or higher. But then if you look at the monsoon specifically, how did the monsoon do for the year? It was 77% of average. So even though it was a pretty challenging dry year, it got better near the end because of the monsoon. And that's really what we want to provide to the ranch is a perspective on the precipitation to help make choices. We also wanted to make it really easy. And so this is a decision and monitoring schedule. I'm not going to go through every piece of it, but I am going to mention what things are being monitored. So there's some critical dates for condition assessment. There's the rainfall. There's checking the wells and the water. There's checking for grasses, non-native grasses, and that's especially important in the spring, and then using fluorescence in July. Tracking the drought conditions. You could do this weekly all year, but we're really recommending if you have to pick a time to do that April through September. Assessing when the agave are bolting is really important because of what I showed initially, the cattle and how they really will eat those stalks if they're not protected. And that's in April and May to really pay attention then. Evaluate grass banking as a strategy, April through October. The Southwest Coordination Center is excellent in that they put out monthly fuel assessments for the region. And so we're recommending reading those and having idea of the fuels in the area. We're also recommending photo points. So specific points on the landscape where twice a year pictures are taken, they're labeled in a specific way, they're stored in a specific place so that the ranchers can look back and see how the conditions were in specific drought, under specific drought conditions. There are some priority trees on the landscape, and there's still some alligator juniper and others that are surviving, but under drought conditions, they're really stressed. And so this is just something to consider based on their condition. Assessing the 7-day fire risk is especially important in June and July. Limiting the outside cattle access is always important, but really the best way to do that is to check the fences, and we're recommending sort of a pre and post monsoon time period for that. And then in April, checking the annual fire danger dates for that particular season. So this, we hope, will make it really easy to operationalize. Another recommendation we have is to pay attention weekly to the drought conditions. So you'll recall the ranch itself is down here in Grant County. So Because of its size, it most likely will always be 100% in a specific type of drought. And you can see at the moment, this week, it's in severe drought, D2. And then there's a spreadsheet that is tied with the precipitation spreadsheet where very quickly you can go in and say, this week, 100% was in D2. So you're able to look back and tie that to photos and have a record for your particular operation. Now, this is really where we get into the meat of what we've done, and it's that the actions are tied to the drought conditions. So it really it's a framework that links specific realistic actions to the drought severity. So during normally dry conditions, the objective is really to increase monitoring and prepare for potential drought. During D1, it's to protect vulnerable resources, and there are specific actions in the plan that tie to each of these drought conditions, and they progress. So right now we're in severe drought or D2, and that is the active management scenario where we want to reduce ecological stress and protect key habitats. And then, as I'll show you in the future, when you're in D3 and D4, we're recommending to stop the grass banking operations. So this is the decision framework. I'll go through this really quickly because I want to keep time for us to have a conversation. But there are some initial considerations. So if it happens to be between April and June in one, there are 3 different pastures. In one of those pastures, which I call the prairie flag pasture, then no grass banking in that place. And that's because there's quite a lot of mature agaves there that we really want to protect that the cattle could certainly have access to. Also, as I mentioned, if we're in D3 or D4, no grass banking. But there are conditions to that. If it's like 2025 and cattle are dying and it really goes against the ethics of the organization to allow that to happen and it's really hard to see, then the south pasture is the pasture where grass banking would be recommended because it has fewer agave and the conditions are such that it can probably handle more grass banking. The second step is to look at the ecological information that I mentioned before, the rainfall, the forage production, the forage outlook, and the seasonal outlook from the Climate Prediction Center. And if 2 or more of these are within the threshold that's listed here, then grass banking can proceed. But there are some recommendations that go along with that. One is to use RAP to estimate the stocking rate, but consider using less than what's recommended because of this particular landscape and the progress that it has made. So I was recommending about 50% of the recommended stocking rate with flexibility based on the rancher's goals. The maximum duration of grass banking for 3 months, evaluating this weekly based on the drought monitor and the other data that we just saw on the last slide. The ranch can terminate this, of course, at any time, and there needs to be some kind of mention in a contract that the cattle need to be removed within 2 weeks of notice. And you should pay attention to the grass and move the cattle around as needed. And then these are the weekly questions to ask yourself during grass banking. Are the drought conditions worsening? Are forage indicators declining? Is vegetation showing stress? And are cattle distribution goals being met? So throughout this process, we ended up with a lot more questions than answers, right? There's so many research questions that could be investigated, including what's the appropriate grazing intensity and timing around agave restoration areas. I'm not going to go through all of these in the interest of time, but I will say that there could be some really incredible research done at this particular location, and there's a lot to investigate. But I do believe the drought plan that we have will support the decisions that the rancher needs to make and to support the ecological goals that the ranch has. So I want to acknowledge many people that contributed to this in a variety of ways. So thanks to all of the people that had conversations about this plan, and special thanks to Bat Conservation International for funding this work. And now I'm going to move into questions and discussion. So I have 3 questions and I'm going to share them all with you now and then possibly stop sharing my screen so that we can all see each other. But I'm curious about what challenges you've seen in implementing drought resilient strategies, how you've seen work incentivized, leading to broader adoption. And for people that want to do this type of holistic conservation work, what are the barriers and the solutions? So, with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so I can see everyone's faces and turn on my video as well. And I'm going to see if I can copy those questions, put them in the chat so we have them so to speak from and to speak about. Here, let me escape. So, any questions?
Tanya, go ahead.
Super. Great presentation, Emily. How was the plan received?
By the rancher?
Yeah.
Well, he was really instrumental in putting it together. He met with us 10 times. And so he was really supportive of the plan. He's really grateful, actually, to have, especially that month by month decision calendar of what needs to happen in which months. The idea of the photo points was new for him, and he was really excited about that because it's something that's doable that can really assess the condition. And there are some young people that live on the ranch as well. And so he's excited to get them involved in some of the data parts of looking at the drought monitor and entering the data.
Mhm.
And I think it will be very helpful to him because he's not a traditional rancher. And so to have access to the data and information, he was pretty blown away, I think, by having that information. And he actually had, of course, he has my number, so he can call at any time if he has any questions or he
Mhm.
knows that. But it was well received.
Cool.
In your experience, how are plans typically received? Because I know you've done a lot of drought plans.
Um, we have, but in sort of almost the opposite direction where we've learned from ranchers how their drought plans have gone. Um, so I can think of a couple examples of folks that we've kind of shared the process with in the same way that we shared the process with you and worked through it. And definitely they were ranchers who had pretty high capacity for dealing with data and thinking of decision making in a pretty structured way. And so that's one thing I'm always kind of interested in is do there need to be different approaches or different levels of maybe how much data you're dealing with. Um, but I agree. I mean, the folks who we work with, that's why I put that in the comments. The folks that we work with who have drought plans not only tell us how they come out better financially and ecologically and everything from drought, but just really that having that all on the paper takes so much stress and mental load off of them during drought. And so I think and I think Retta in Colorado has seen the same thing. So um, that's been nice.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the data part because I was struggling with that because, of course, as a scientist, I love data and pulling it together, but how much can I expect somebody else who's incredibly busy, right? One person running this entire ranch to do. And
Mhm.
so that's why I kept it pretty limited. Like
Mhm.
in the rainfall spreadsheet, um, monthly editions of something, an annual edition of some information, and then weekly just checking the drought monitor. So I tried to keep it pretty limited, just with the expectation that if those are the only things that he can do, that's
Mhm.
going to give him enough information about whether or not grass banking is a good idea. Yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, it looks fantastic. And yes, I love the calendar with the different tasks and the color coordination.
Thanks. Initially, there was no color coordination, and I realized I needed to
Mhm.
like make vegetation green and
Mhm.
fire pink. So it's a process, right? Because this
Yeah.
is new for me as well to try to understand what a specific landscape that has different goals that aren't particularly agriculture, how to use an agricultural framework um, to help create a drought plan.
Mhm.
Got a couple
Hi,
questions for
Ariel.
you. Hi.
Yeah.
Um, my first question is, how did you get BLM to commit to monitoring?
Well, they're pretty amazing BLM folks that we're working with, and they are the BLM wildlife manager that we've been working with there is really committed to supporting the area, and she has been instrumental in pulling in her colleagues and bringing them out and bringing out the botanist and the botanist saying, okay, yeah. And I've been hounding the poor botanist as well, saying, hey, can we have a long-term aim plot here? So I think it's just a combination of people knowing people and people being really committed to supporting this particular ranch.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, because monitoring is always such a limiting um, factor. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of resources. So really lucky that, and also I think shows the skill of relationship building that this rancher and the team has, which is great. Um, I had another question. Oh, the other question was maybe a little bit more technical, where I was wondering why you use the drought um, indices of like the drought categories or precipitation instead of something like the standard precipitation SPEI, like that looks at temperature as well, and thinking about like how ecologically relevant that drought might be instead of just like how much rain happened. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's a question I have.
No, that's a great question. And I did looked at a lot, right? I thought about the different like SPI, SPEI, the drought monitor, which one should I use? And for a few reasons, I went with the drought monitor. One is that it's so incredibly accessible. It's built on a variety of different pieces of data. So it's not just rainfall or a lot of thought goes into the drought monitor authors changing the distribution of the drought conditions, and it's not just biophysical information. It's a variety of things that go in. And another reason that I picked it, number one, it's easy, right? It's available. It changes every Thursday, so it's there. And then while that isn't particularly important for this rancher at the moment, a lot of the USDA drought programs are tied to the drought monitor conditions. So if you want funding for some kind of loss related to drought, is tied to the drought monitor. And so that's another reason, because it's just universally available and easy. Um, but you're right. I mean, I wanted to add many different drought indices. I had to hold myself back. But for this location, it to me it made sense.
It's
Yeah,
great.
and Tanya, sorry, people are
Oh,
familiar with it and understand the categories pretty well. Yeah, it's pretty easy,
yeah.
which was important. Yeah, go
The
ahead.
last piece is I was curious about the spatial, like the scale at which those drought indices are usable. Like, does that map onto how large a ranch would be well, or like, yeah, just thinking about the scale and the spatial orientation of like, a ranch versus a county or something like that. Curious to
And are
get
you
thoughts about
asking
that.
specifically about the US drought monitor and that scale, or are you asking about other drought indices?
The drought monitor specifically, like those drought categories, and thinking because I've looked at sometimes that, state or county wide and been like, oh, like this ranch kind of falls on a weird line. It's like in between, and I don't know. It just seems like there's a little bit of a mismatch.
Yeah.
Sometimes I don't know.
It's tricky because I absolutely understand what you're saying, because there's microclimatology, right? There are a lot of different things that can be happening at a ranch that the drought monitor at that scale of when the entire entirety of Grant County is pretty much one classification, just isn't going to capture. So yeah, it's tricky. And I think, and that's why I did say in the plan and told the rancher to trust your gut, right? So if you can tell that Bitter Creek or Apache Creek are having some impacts that you're not seeing in the drought conditions, make a change. And that's another reason that I included all four of those pieces of data or information into for the class banking decision framework. So it's not just the drought monitor, but you're looking at your own, actually there's 5 more pieces of information: the rainfall in your local gauge, the rat production information, grasscast, and the climate prediction center. So I think having multiple streams of evidence along with just trusting your gut, because there are going to be localized impacts that are not going to be as readily tied to there's just broad scale drought conditions, right? So yeah, good questions. And I do want to say that BLM has agreed to monitor once a year, sort of a point sample, basically go out one time a year. They have yet to agree to do a long-term monitoring plat. So but we're in conversations. So hopefully that'll happen. Yeah, thanks for those questions. I'm curious about other people's experience or other questions. What challenges have you seen implementing drought resilient strategies? Um, how have you seen work incentivized? Any personal experiences you might want to share would be great. Okay. Well, any other questions? I do want to acknowledge Paige Ramsey. She's here. She did all of the mapping for this project. So thank you, Paige, for that, with many, many iterations of maps. So appreciate you.
I just want
I
to.
don't,
Oh,
yeah, go
sorry.
ahead, Kristen.
Hey, yeah. So this is Kristen Lear with Bat Conservation International. Just wanted to say from our end, having this key piece of our broader agave restoration initiative for 3 species of threatened nectar bats is really helping us kind of launch this work with ranchers in the Southwest, and really tackle one of the main challenges of facing these nectar bats that rely on agave plants in these landscapes. So, having this initial plan and this kind of pilot is really helping us figure out, how can we integrate wildlife restoration, focused work, bat conservation into these working rangelands, into these drought management plans, so that we're tackling these issues from wildlife, from people, livelihoods, ecosystems, all angles. So from our end, this has been extremely helpful for this piece of the puzzle for these bats.
Thanks, Kristen. And it's pretty exciting that I really do think the endangered Mexican long-nosed bat is probably there. They're doing eDNA analysis right now to identify if it's there or not.
Yeah, either
Haven't
now
seen
or
it
will
yet.
be, right? And with we're seeing these bats kind of shifting with increasing drought, needing to kind of shift areas, and we are seeing them further north into the Silver City, Gila area, and further west. So if they're not at this ranch now, I would very much suspect soon they will be.
Right. And so it's really fun to see also this organization planting 600 agaves at this place where the bats are moving towards, because it takes 30 years for the agave to, flower. And so it feels like a climate adaptation strategy, really, in such a powerful way. So it's fun to see. And it's also fun because there are some patches of agave that have been there for a long time that really seem like they were planted. And so it makes you wonder if there were ancient people in the same area doing the same thing for a specific reason. And so it makes you feel like part of a much longer arc of history when you think about like agave as part of the landscape, but that humans have been part of. contributing to that, just like BCI is now. So that's been a fun element of the project. And if anybody has any other drought planning questions, I know that a few of you are here from Audubon and other organizations. I'd be happy to talk with you about specific locations and kind of specific needs that may be different from the ones that this particular ranch had, BCI. Yes, I will be happy to share the slides. I'll send them along to Noah. And does that make sense, Noah, to send them to you and you can share them with everybody? Okay. Or I can send them to you directly, Ariel, because I have your contact information. Yeah, I'll be happy to share them. Oh, and Tanya, thanks. Oh, yes, more examples. Do you want to say anything about that?
Sure. Yeah. So the drought planning uh, methodology that partly influenced Emily's work is found on an NDMC resource called Managing Drought Risk on the Ranch. The web address is ranchdrought.unl.edu. And if you look in the planning tab, for example, there's just a series of fact sheets and worksheets that walk you through a very similar process. Um, it and many of there's links to many of the tools and resources that Emily was using, not all of them, but a lot of them. And there's a tab called like Learn or something like that, I think it's called, um, where you can find case studies of other ranchers who have shared their drought plans with us. And Ariel, thanks for your question. This there's an Arizona case study on the website. There's a Colorado case study on the website, and a Texas and a South Central Kansas are probably kind of the closest. The resources were originally developed in the context of the Great Plains, but in its most recent iteration, it should be applicable throughout most of the Western US. So we would love to add more case studies, and I will be following up with Emily to hopefully add this as a case study and example that others can learn from.
Well, thanks so much, everyone, for being here and for the good questions. Noah, I'll turn it back to you. I don't know if you have any final things for the group.
Yeah, thanks. I guess just to hold a minute here in case anybody has any announcements or anything they'd like to share. One thing I just remembered came into my inbox is some jobs that the Quivira Coalition is hiring for that are very relevant to what we're talking about here. So I just dropped their link in there, but they're hiring people for their Soil to Supper program, working with ranchers on conservation programs. So some people in here might be great candidates or know somebody. And yeah, so if anybody else has anything to share with the group in these last minutes here. And if not, I'll go ahead and